Imagine being told that you and your closest friends are going to be dropped into one of the coldest, most unforgiving places on the face of this planet, with nothing but the clothes on your backs and whatever you can carry, no heated shelter waiting for you, no restaurant around the corner, no warm bed to crawl into at night, just endless frozen wilderness stretching us hot in every direction in a temperature so brutal that 10 minutes of exposure to the wind can literally freeze a human limb solid. And then imagine being told you have to survive there not for one night, not for a weekend, but for 7 full days with no way out unless you are willing to shave your head completely bald in front of everyone. That is exactly the challenge that 6 friends set for themselves when they flew out to the Arctic and stepped off a plane into 2 feet of snow with no tents, no pre-built shelter, and no guarantee that any of them would make it through the week without serious injury. And what happened over those 7 days pushed every single one of them to the absolute edge of what the human body and mind can handle before finally breaking. The very first objective on day 1 was simply to survive the night, and that meant building a shelter from scratch in the middle of an Arctic wilderness before the sun went down. Because once darkness fell in that environment, the temperature would drop to levels where staying outside without proper cover was not just uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening. And every minute they spent arguing about how to dig the snow cave properly was a minute less of daylight. They had to get it done. They dug into a massive snowbank with shovels and bare hands, carving out a hollow in the frozen wall deep enough to fit 6 grown men lying side by side. And the deeper they went, the harder and more compacted the snow became, turning what should have been a straightforward digging task into hours of exhausting physical labor in a landscape where even breathing the cold air felt like swallowing glass. And the whole time the sun was moving across the sky at a pace that felt almost deliberately cruel. Building a fire turned out to be its own desperate battle because the firewood they gathered was either wet from snow or so frozen that getting a spark to catch and hold felt like trying to light a fire in a swimming pool. And the moment one of them finally got a flame going and started melting snow into drinking water, the celebration lasted about 30 seconds before someone leaned too close and set their jacket on fire. Which, in any other situation, would have been funny, but in sub-zero temperatures with no spare clothing was genuinely terrifying. The snow cave they built that first night was so small that not everyone could fit inside it with their legs fully extended. And one member of the group ended up sleeping partially outside, with frost forming on his sleeping bag through the night. And when morning came, on day 2, the camera equipment itself had nearly frozen solid, and the temperature had dropped so far below zero that the ground outside their camp was a sheet of ice so thick it might as well have been concrete. Food ran out faster than anyone had planned, partly because they had only brought 3 or 4 days' worth of supplies, expecting to supplement it by fishing. And the fishing turned out to be one of the most physically and emotionally brutal parts of the entire experience, because the ice over the lake near their camp was so thick that their drilling equipment could not break through it, no matter how long they worked. And after hours of exhausting drilling in freezing conditions, they came back to camp with nothing to show for it, while morale hit its lowest point of the entire week. One of the group members developed frostbite symptoms on his toes during day 2, when the temperature dropped so severely at night that even being inside the snow cave could not fully protect them, and watching the color drain from someone's feet. While you are all crammed into a frozen hole in the ground with no medical help available and a rescue plane that cannot fly because of the weather, is a moment that strips away every comfortable illusion about how in control of a situation you think you are. The blizzard that hit on day 3 made everything worse in ways that felt almost personally targeted, covering their camp in fresh snow that buried their cooking equipment, soaking through their clothes with wet snow that then froze against their skin as the temperature dropped, destroying the path they had marked to the river, and making it essentially impossible to start a fire because every piece of firewood they had was now completely saturated with water that had turned to ice in the night. The mental toll of standing in the middle of a frozen Arctic landscape on day 3 with no food, soaking wet clothes, a fire that refused to start, a teammate with frostbitten toes, and 4 more days still stretching ahead of you was something to... Pat, several of the group members later said, felt like being pressed down by a weight they could not see and could not fight. A slow, creeping despair that had nothing dramatic about it and was far more dangerous for that reason because it made the flare gun that would summon the rescue plane and end all of it look more tempting with every hour that passed. What kept them going was the kind of stubborn refusal to give up that does not feel heroic in the moment and only looks that way in retrospect. Because in the moment, it just feels like being too exhausted and too cold and too committed to the idea of not failing again to make the rational decision to quit. And that combination of stubbornness, pride, and genuine care for the people around them pushed all 6 of them through the hardest days and into the back half of the week, where things slowly, painfully began to turn around. The breakthrough came when they used a drone to scout the frozen lake from above and spotted a river bend where the moving water below the ice kept the surface thinner and more penetrable, And after another brutal cross-country trek through deep snow, across a frozen lake on cross-country skis, and through dense frozen forest in snowshoes, they finally drilled through to the water below and spent the next several hours in the biting cold waiting for a fish to bite on a handmade line with frozen food scraps as bait. When a fish finally bit and the line went taut and the group erupted into screaming celebration in the middle of a frozen Arctic riverbank, while the temperature kept dropping around them, it was one of those moments that does not feel real while it is happening, because the relief is too enormous and the context is too extreme, and the fact that you caught a fish through a hole in the ice while your toes are turning colors and your clothes are soaking wet somehow feels like the greatest achievement in human history. And in that specific moment, it genuinely was. 2 fish made it back to camp that night. Cooked over a fire, they managed to start using dry wood from the inside of a dead tree that still had dry fibers at its core, and the 6 of them sat around that fire in their snow cave, eating fresh caught Arctic fish and laughing at each other's misery in the way that only people who have genuinely been through something terrible together can laugh. And day 6 became the best day of the entire week, because after everything that had gone wrong, there was food and warmth, and the finish line was finally close enough to feel real. Day 7 arrived, and all 6 of them made it, which meant they had done what they set out to do and survived 7 days in one of the harshest environments on Earth with nothing but their own resourcefulness, each other, and a stubbornness that refused to let the Arctic win. And the rescue that finally came at the end was not a helicopter, but a team of Arctic sled dogs that pulled them out across the snow in the most perfectly cinematic ending to one of the most genuinely difficult things any of them had ever done. If this video gave you a new level of respect for what the human body and mind can survive, when the only option is to keep going, drop a comment below and subscribe to War Chronicles, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you.